Okay, I guess we're going to start. My name is Francisco Monaldi. I am a fellow in Latin American Energy Policy here at the Baker Institute at Rice University. On behalf of the Center for Energy Studies, I welcome you to this webinar. This is sort of, it's going to be sort of an informal conversation, sort of a happy hour conversation between me and Mark Jones, who is a professor of political science here at Rice University and also a fellow and the Jamal Chair of Latin American Studies. Welcome, Mark.
No, thanks, Francisco.
So we're going to be discussing these very turbulent times that we're having in Latin America, that of course, this was probably the case even before 2020. You know, we had a very tumultuous year last year with political unrest and instability, changes in government throughout the region after some years of low growth. So, Mark, can you talk a little bit about what was the situation before this pandemic and oil price collapse started?
Oh, thanks, Francisco, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Well, I think if we go back even as sort of close to now as late December, early January of 2020, Latin America was already, most of the region, at least in some type of crisis mode. Commodity prices were low, and the region depends heavily on commodities. And a large number of populist leaders had either run into some pitfalls or at least were experiencing some difficulties. So Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, who had relatively high levels of popularity in the mid to high 60s, saw his popularity declining rapidly as Mexico began to experience the economic problems that were expectable, or that were to be expected, given AMLO's relatively negative or at least anti-business type policies. We also saw countries like Chile, which for more than 20 years was the golden child of Latin America, was the country that everyone pointed to as a model for all other Latin American countries to follow. We saw its relatively high levels of inequality reach a breaking point, which resulted in high levels of protest, violence in the streets, things that we weren't used to associating with Chile, and caused President Sebastián Piñera to agree to a relatively unprecedented constitutional reform that could dramatically change the way Chilean politics is structured. And that could be good in the sense that it provides a safety valve, but it also could be bad in the sense that one of the strengths that Chile has had, the pillars upon which its economic growth and prosperity have been based, are the constitution and the rules of the game presently in place. So as Chile begins to meddle and fiddle with those rules, it could improve things, but they also could cause the country to go south. We also, in neighboring Bolivia, saw Evo Morales engage in fraud in an attempt to be reelected, a type of reelection that he shouldn't have been allowed under the constitutional rules. We saw popular protests there, eventually force him to resign with new elections called. Those elections were then delayed and they'll occur theoretically later in the month of May. Then in Argentina, Alberto Fernandez took over from Mauricio Macri, but amidst really strong economic crisis in Argentina, with inflation in the 40 to 50% range, an unsustainable external and domestic debt that needed to be renegotiated, as well as relatively meager economic growth. Perhaps the only real bright spots in the region were you could say, and then and we can talk about Jair Bolsonaro and all of the problems in Brazil. That would probably require a separate webinar. But the only two sort of islands of prosperity were Uruguay, which is always sort of easygoing and not much of the way of problems, and then Peru, where Martin Vizcarra was able to actually get Peru moving in a relatively positive direction.
Yes, so this region was already in significant disarray, which contrasted, as you pointed out, a lot of it is due to the commodity dependency in the region, particularly in South America and Mexico. Mexico much less than South America, but we're coming out of in 2014 of a decade of growth that some people call the sort of the golden decade of Latin America. I mean, we hadn't seen as much growth as that since decades ago, since probably the 50s and 60s. We also saw at that time presidents with very high levels of popularity, including the Kirchners, Lula, Hugo Chavez, Álvaro Uribe. It was a decade that marked by dramatic reductions in poverty, presidents, popular president. It was an easy time, and most presidents were reelected, and even in many countries that didn't have re-election before, they changed to be allowed to have re-elections. The contrast is dramatic with the last few years. Very few presidents are as popular as the ones in the past, and of course the economy has a lot to do with it. A lot of these countries did not take advantage of the high commodity price period to accumulate significant sovereign wealth funds or other cushions to manage the decline in commodities, and as a result, they are suffering the consequences. Even the ones who manage the best, like Chile, Peru, and Colombia, have seen some significant sort of political upheaval, because of course it's not the same, when you went from being poor to be middle class, and you were progressing and you were starting to demand a lot of additional things like better healthcare, better education, and then all of a sudden you not only are not getting those things, but you are going back a significant amount of the significant proportion of the population is reducing their standard of living. On top of that, you have the corruption scandals in Latin America during this period. Of course the most famous, the Lava Jato in Brazil, and other bread scandals all over the region. So that was a very explosive combination, and you could see in many countries the highest dissatisfaction with the institutions and political system that we have seen in many years in the region. So as a whole, even though, as you mentioned, there are some bright spots, this is a region that has been in deep trouble. And on top of that, now we have a collapse in the price of oil, and we will talk about that later, about the countries that are mostly affected by that, but also, of course, the pandemic that affects everybody in the world, but that affects these type of countries probably more. So can you tell us a little bit about the status of the situation right now, sort of the way that these countries are dealing with this, and sort of take it from there?
Well, okay, so I think if we're thinking about how the countries have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been very, I guess we would say, very diverse and varied. Now, the pandemic came later to the region than most of the world, so there was a little more time for countries to prepare for the worst. I think the most stringent and most effective measures we've seen thus far are in Argentina, where President Alberto Fernandez, from a very early point, decided that Argentines needed to enter a quarantine. And the Argentine quarantine is a real quarantine. It's not like the United States, where it's please stay at home if you want to, but if you don't want to, don't worry about it. Argentina, the residents are being required to stay at home. They can only leave for short periods of time to buy food and medicine, or to go to work if they're in essential jobs. And the Argentine definition of essential is much more narrow than here in the United States. So Argentines have been effectively staying at home since March 20th, and that quarantine's been extended into early May. And it's been very popular. We see a level of agreement among Argentines that you don't see any other time except when the national selection or the national side is playing soccer. Over 90% of Argentines support the policies of Alberto Fernandez. And so it's been a very effective policy. And it's a smart policy because the reality is, if the COVID-19 virus gets into the conurbano or the more impoverished suburbs of Argentina, it's going to spread like wildfire because social distancing there is very difficult. And the fact that you have 4, 5, 6 people, often 3 generations living in 2 rooms or 3 rooms. And so Alberto Fernandez has, I think, done the more responsible thing in trying to shut everything down for the shortest time possible and protect his population. Now, a sharp contrast is to his neighbor to the north, Jair Bolsonaro, who even today is out hugging, and if not hugging and kissing, at least walking the streets of Brasilia, talking to people, and essentially saying that COVID-19 is nothing more than a common cold. And Brazil, I think, has the potential to have serious problems from COVID-19, the pandemic, but also we know that any problems Brazil has will transfer across its borders to other countries. If not in terms of actual spreading of the virus, at least in terms of economic problems, because once Argentina gets back to normal, it still needs a relatively robust Brazilian market to export most of its manufacturing to, because most Argentine manufacturing is not really competitive outside of Mercosur, and so it really needs that Brazilian market. AMLO in Mexico started off relatively relaxed and dismissive of the virus. Over time, he has become, I think, more stringent and has adopted a quarantine. But I think one of the things that drove both AMLO and perhaps Bolsonaro, although I don't want to try to get into his head, but I think at least if we're looking at AMLO in Mexico, is the reality that roughly half of workers in Latin America are informal workers, higher in some countries, a little lower in others. But if you think about 1 out of every 2 workers is in the informal sector, those individuals don't have any type of social safety net other than perhaps bags of food that are occasionally dropped off. And we have surveys that I'm doing with some colleagues in Argentina where roughly 1/3 of Argentines in the Buenos Aires metro area don't have enough food at home or money to buy food to last them more than a day or 2. And so they can't afford to stay in quarantine without some type of help. And I think that's one of the things that AMLO was thinking about, although over time he began to realize that the threat of COVID-19 outweighed the economic consequences, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges for Latin America, as you point out, that reality is almost everywhere, a reality of inequality, significant informal sector, not great safety net. In some countries, the health system is much worse than others, so there are some significant differences. But all of them have, the difficulty of how do you ask people to stay home when when a significant proportion of the population not only lives in very dense popular areas, but also they live day to day and they don't have savings, etc. So and even if you want to do a stimulus like the US to send them money, I mean now we have some technologies like through cell phones and the like, but most of these states don't have the capacity, although there are some cash transfer programs in some of these countries to really, help these communities, these poor communities at this time. And I think the other big challenge is that, the US is, for example, and European countries prepare these massive packages of fiscal stimulus. But Latin American countries, particularly the ones that were in worse fiscal shape to begin with, do not have any room to do that. A few do have, and going back to your example of Peru, Peru is a notable case because they did manage properly the macro economic cycle, commodity cycle. They did accumulate, reserves and a fiscal space to now have a very expansionary fiscal policy. But Argentina, Ecuador, Venezuela, and even the other countries will have a tough time trying to sort of get back the economy and help the population that is in such a vulnerable situation. So one has to really worry how much these quarantines will actually be enforceable in some of these countries, and therefore I hope that either the temperature or recently there is the idea that maybe the vaccine, the tuberculosis vaccine might help these countries compared to the developed countries, but I think it's a very scary situation of what might happen in the region. So let me talk a little bit about oil. So there are countries in the region that are significantly oil dependent, and there are major producers that are not as dependent. For example, the two largest producers in the region are Brazil, that almost produces 3 million barrels, a country that has a spectacular growth in oil production over the last 2 decades. And the second largest producer is Mexico, with a declining production. But these two very large oil producers are not significant net exporters. In fact, in the case of Brazil, they consume more than what they produce. And in the case of Mexico, at this point, is very even. And moreover, these two economies are quite diversified. In the case of Mexico, you do still have some fiscal dependence, but in Brazil, much less. Having said that, the oil industry in both countries is really important. And in the case of Mexico, the issue is that Pemex, the national company, is highly indebted and has a very difficult situation because they lost about $18 billion last year. The government has to infuse a significant amount of capital, reduce taxes, and as I said, production is going down. And for ideological reasons, President López Obrador is not willing to give the private sector the space that it could have because of the energy reform. But going back to which countries are the most vulnerable, without a doubt, Venezuela, that we'll talk about it later, is the country that is most dependent, that is in worse shape to begin with, and that really will have a major impact. Then you have Ecuador, a country that has a significant dependence on oil. Is being hit significantly also by the pandemic, particularly the city of Guayaquil, and on top of that was already in an IMF austerity program with a lot of political backlash. And it's a country dollarized, so they have very little room to, for example, devalue and help other exports. So Ecuador, it might default soon, and it's a country that is going to be in trouble. And then you have Colombia, a country that is in much better shape, of course, than Ecuador, but that does have significant dependence. More than half of exports were oil, so that's going to be a problem. And then the three other, big countries, I think I already mentioned Brazil, and I mean, in the case of Brazil, the problem is not, they will even have, a relatively easy time because of their low cost, except for 200,000 barrels that they are already closing of high cost production. But then you have Argentina, that we will talk about now, which is, of course, a country that was counting on the development of the massive resources in Vaca Muerta, but those resources require higher oil prices. So, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about what's the economic situation that Argentina will face? How is Vaca Muerta going to fare, and how is this likely to affect Alberto Fernandez, that, as you mentioned, now is very popular because of the way he's attacking the pandemic? But what are the sort of effects for Argentina of this crisis?
Well, Argentines have for quite some time placed quite a great deal of hope on the development of the Vaca Muerta shale play. It's arguably the second largest shale reserves in the world. I think it's fourth largest in terms of liquids, but it's certainly has a tremendous potential to help Argentina and provide the growth and economic revenue that it needs to be successful. Now that said, it's become very difficult to think about the Vaca Muerta development in the context of both the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the growing problems related to oil supply and oil prices at the global level. So for Argentina, for even YPF in their best fields in the Vaca Muerta, they need Brent at about $30 to make any money whatsoever. In the sort of less valuable areas, which YPF tends to take the best areas for themselves and then give the other areas to other groups. But for what remains, it's most of those companies are not making much in the way of money when you throw in all of Argentina's general costs. And it's the same for gas. So we're unlikely to see much in the way of any new investment in Argentina in the Vaca Muerta until we have some type of certainty that Brent is going to be up in the 40s or 50s. There could be there may be a little bit just to maintain where people are because it's such a rich and lucrative and potentially valuable place to be. The super majors are going to want to be there, but I wouldn't see them investing too much. Now, one area where there has been some discussion in Argentina is to try to incentivize more oil production by doing what they used to call the Creole barrel, where they would essentially pay an internal price that was higher than the global Brent price. So set it at $50. The difficulty with doing that now is that was done in an era when there was quite a bit of government subsidies to be given to cover that difference. Now, given that the government is broke, they would have to be passing on almost all of that cost to consumers. And in the light of the way things are in Argentina, I think that's very unlikely. Along the lines of Argentina's difficult situation is the foreign debt. When Alberto Fernandez took over in December of 2019, it was recognized by pretty much everyone that Argentina's foreign debt was unsustainable and they weren't going to be able to continue without some type of restructuring. That restructuring has been delayed. Right now, it's likely that they're going to try to restructure unilaterally their internal domestic debt and then leave for later restructuring the foreign debt if they can afford to make the payments. But as the crisis goes longer and longer and the need for social services to provide a safety net for Argentines goes greater, it's going to be tougher for Argentina even to make the modest foreign debt payments that it has coming due during 2020. And so the risk of a default of some type is going to grow.
Yeah, one issue, of course, with the policy of having higher domestic prices is that right now there is not even the demand, right? So for at least the next few months, that is not necessarily going to help. And as we have discussed, I mean, the issue, of course, with Argentina is that it has had a history of reneging on deals like that in the past, and so that will make companies hesitant to do significant investments. So Argentina is going to be in a tough spot. And what do you think in terms of the politics of the next elections in Argentina and sort of the future of politics in Argentina this might entail, or is it too early to tell?
Well, it's probably too early to tell in the sense that Argentines don't think beyond really the next election. The next election in Argentina is in October of 2021. It's a midterm election. And that will be a real test of Alberto Fernandez to consider how viable he is in terms of running for re-election in 2023. But I think there will be considerable pressure on him now, and that's going to link into the restructuring of the debt, where at the minimum, Fernandez is going to want all interest payments and all principal payments postponed until after his potential re-election in 2023. I think that's the only way that the Argentines are going to agree to any type of restructuring, is that Fernandez is given time to run for re-election without having the weight of paying foreign debt over his back. If the creditors, the IMF, as well as foreign creditors, aren't going to give him that, then I think he will probably take the route that Argentines have taken many times before, and that's simply the default. Right now, though, Fernandez, actually, the COVID-19 crisis has been good for him in terms of his popularity. From the moment he took over in December of 2019, his approval rating has been very close to his actual electoral support in the October 2019 election. He won 48% of the vote, and his approval rating was up at about 48%, never hitting 50%. And then in January and February, began to go down to about 38% before the COVID-19 crisis hit. And after one full week of the crisis, his approval rating had shot up from 38% up to 70%. And it stayed up in that range, dropping a little bit down to 68% in the subsequent weeks. But I think without question, when Alberto Fernandez arrived in office in December of 2019, he was seen as a co-president. So someone who had obtained his position only because Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner realized she couldn't win re-election. She couldn't win election on her own. So she handpicked him to be her presidential candidate, and she ran as his vice presidential candidate. So when he took office, he was seen as co-governing with Cristina Fernandez. At the same time, the Macri forces, who won 42% of the vote, viewed him as someone who was not their president, and so from a legitimacy perspective, they viewed him as not representing all Argentines. And so in some ways, one way to think about Fernandez is Alberto Fernandez, up until the COVID-19 crisis, was a co-president who governed only for half of the Argentine population. That's all changed over the past few weeks, where he's moved from being the head of government. So remember, in the presidential system, someone is both the head of government, that is a leader of the political party or whatever political grouping is in power, and the head of state. And the idea of a head of state is that you're the unifying leader of the entire country. Parliamentary systems do this much more cleanly, in that, say, in the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, the prime minister, is the head of government, and Queen Elizabeth is the head of state. What Alberto Fernandez has become over the past few weeks is a true head of state. He's no longer the president, the co-president, along with Cristina Fernandez, of one half of Argentines. He's rather the sole president, and he's the president of all Argentines. And it really contrasts in what he's done there in Argentina with what we see with Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who continues to be a partisan, divisive president. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who also continues to be partisan and divisive. And then let alone President Donald Trump here in the United States, who continues to be partisan and divisive. So that's created the potential for Alberto Fernandez to really expand his political influence and political power. But it all depends, of course, on him both defeating the coronavirus, but also riding the economic ship over the end of the year and into the next year. And that's going to be quite difficult, as you mentioned, Francisco, given the debt load, the weak economic growth, and the lack of the Vaca Muerta to really represent the engine of growth that many in Argentina hope it will someday.
Yeah, that's a very interesting take. It's amazing how crisis can really, change the political landscape. On the other hand, it's hard to know eventually when the economic crisis takes a hold, if the presidents that were popular at the beginning will continue to be popular. Please, we are not having the Q&A function working. So please, for those of you who want to ask questions, ask them through the chat function. And Mark, you can start sort of reading. There are some questions over there. Before moving into the questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Venezuela crisis. So Venezuela is without a doubt the country that is hit the most by this crisis, because it's sort of a perfect storm of things happening for Venezuela. It already had a decline of 2/3 of GDP before this crisis. Oil production was collapsing, and it sort of had stabilized, but a combination of additional sanctions by the U.S. to Rosneft, the Russian national company that was helping Venezuela's PDVSA to export and avoid the sanctions, and after being the subsidiaries that were doing that trading being sanctioned by the U.S., basically what happened was that the Russians decided to stop doing that, sell the assets to a wholly owned company of the Russian state, and so Rosneft got out. Still too early to tell how the Russians are going to continue to play their hand, but the combination of such low prices with sanctions that lead to significant discounts and the decline in production of Venezuela that could be soon as low as 500,000 barrels per day from 1.3 million before the sanctions and 3.4 million when Hugo Chavez came into power. This combined with the humanitarian tragedy that the country was already living, the worst probably healthcare system in the region, and on top of that, the country, the other sort of source of dollars that had outside of oil was recently the remittances from the 5 million plus Venezuelans that had left the country recently. But that's another issue that is going to affect a lot of countries in the region, the lack of remittances, because these migrants in Colombia, in Peru, in the case of Venezuelans, but similarly, other countries like Mexico that have tons of migrants in the US will be significantly affected by the pandemic and the quarantines. And as a result, the countries in the region will not only be affected by the commodity prices, but will also be affected by the remittances and of course the general economic activity. So these are going to be very tough time for the regions. Of course, the US government is trying to push for a regime change in Venezuela, taking advantage of this crisis. It's hard to know if this is gonna work out, but I'm pretty concerned about the consequences for political instability, in the region of all this situation, Mark, because we saw during the financial crisis, Latin America actually fared relatively well. They had reserves because of the commodity boom. China recovered quickly, and also therefore commodities recovered relatively quickly. But this time we're coming out of 4 years of bad economic performance. We have low trust in government that temporarily might go up for the reasons that you mentioned, for example, like Alberto Fernandez. But one has to wonder how is the region going to fare in the next decade or so if the consequences of the financial crisis in many countries have been the rise of populism, the decline of democracy, and the like. How a crisis of the magnitude that Latin America is going to have is going to affect the region. I don't know if you have any thoughts about sort of I know it's very speculative, but about the future.
Well, I think without question, it's going to be difficult. And I could touch on a point you mentioned on remittances. That is going to be a major issue for the whole region, but especially Central America, because countries like Honduras and El Salvador are extremely dependent on remittances. The one silver lining they have is that at least to date in the United States, the construction industry, as well as the yard care industry, have remained open and functioning, which is, for especially undocumented immigrants, is one of the principal, for male undocumented immigrants, is the principal labor source. So there's at least a little bit of money flowing, but by and large, we are going to see remittances plummet to Latin America, and those countries like the Central American countries that are especially dependent on remittances in the Northern Triangle are going to get hit very hard. But I just touch on a couple of the questions that have been launched. One asked about Guyana, which I think is actually was a very interesting question, in that 3 months ago, Guyana, everything was golden, in Guyana. That is, they were looking at global oil prices were high. ExxonMobil was essentially producing at levels that even they hadn't expected, and they were going to hold a new election that would then signal who would be in office for the next 5 years, sort of governing over that bonanza. Because of serious allegations and evidence of fraud in the Guyanan elections, there's strong pressure on Prime Minister David Granger to either provide evidence that the elections were not fraudulent or risk high levels of sanctions. And so that's a real problem that Guyana is now facing, that concomitant with the decline in oil prices and therefore the bonanza that won't be as large as they had hoped is the potential for international sanctions for fraudulent elections. And then the potential for going into the International Court of Justice in a much more weakened position in their battle against Venezuela to decide who controls a large share of the Caribbean where this oil is being found. One other question I'll touch on, and then I'll flip it over to you, Francisco, is Argentina and this idea of a Creole barrel. I don't think it's very likely that they're going to be able to. It gets discussed a lot, and it's presented. I think it's being used more as a way to sort of dangle a carrot in front of the energy companies that there is some hope for increased revenue by saying that we can actually go, because Argentina in the past did have this Creole barrel where they paid above Brent prices for domestically produced oil. That was, though, in an era when government wealth, as Francisco talked about, was much higher during the early or the middle part of the Kirchner era, where the government had the money to pay subsidies, and then also when consumers were in a position to pay above market rates. Right now, the government has no extra money to pay subsidies, and consumers are going to be stretched so tightly that I don't think they're going to have the money. So I think that's probably more of a pipe dream than anything else, but it's something to at least give the energy companies some hope, because what Alberto Fernandez wants is for the minimum our energy companies to keep things moving forward in Argentina. That is maybe a lot slower than they were otherwise going to do. But what he doesn't want to see happen is a large number of companies decide to pull up stakes and essentially leave the country or sell off to local investors and then exit, which would make any type of recovery and investment in the future all the more difficult to launch at the time where we start to see Brent in the 35, or really more the 40 to 50 range, because really, realistically for the Vaca Muerta, Brent has to be in the 40, 50 to 60, somewhere between 45 and 55 for companies to seriously begin investing in the Vaca Muerta and producing, and that's oil. Natural gas is still a very tricky issue in Argentina because of the high use of natural gas on the domestic market and the need, if you were actually going to take full advantage of the Vaca Muerta's natural gas assets, the need to engage in very expensive construction of LNG plants, of petrochemical plants, things that would anchor the country or any company in Argentina and give the government much more leverage over them at the time that the Argentine government, say, would want to reduce the price it pays for things. And the Argentine government has a long history of waiting for private companies to effectively have sunk costs so that they're at a point where they can't exit, and then changing the rules of the game.
I wanted to comment on what you said about Guyana. I think it's an amazing story. You know, it's a country that I don't know if everyone knows, but it's going to be the largest producer per capita of oil in the world, because it has a small population and it's going to be a very significant producer. That is, of course, if everything goes as planned and Exxon makes the significant investments that it has planned, and you know, and politically the country sort of moves in sort of at least an acceptable direction. But the challenges are significant because of what's happened in the election. And I mean, at least I think for them, it's better than the price collapse before they, you know, really became a big producer and started having they just were starting to produce just at the right time in which the price declined. I think most of the investments in Guyana are still viable, but depending on how long these low price, very low prices stay, you know, it might affect the investments there and might delay significantly the development of the sector. And in the middle of a country with a very polarized society and, you know, ethnically divided, that could be a recipe for disaster to manage the size of the rents that Guyana it's going to manage. And now with the increased uncertainty about how this is going to happen. I just wanted, before getting back to you, Mark, talk a little bit about a question about what is Mexico thinking about the OPEC deal? It's an amazing story, and I will not have time to go all over all the details. But the Mexico was invited to participate and join the conversation of the OPEC sort of plus agreement. Basically, is an agreement to cut 10 million barrels per day of oil production, about 10% of the world oil production during the months of May and June. And Mexico was asked, as sort of everybody else, to reduce about 23% their production with respect to a baseline at the end of 2018. And those were, OPEC countries plus other countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, and other significant non-OPEC producers. And Mexico, shockingly, basically not only did not agree with the arrangement after participating in the conference, but the Secretary of Energy, Rocío Nale, left the meeting, the virtual meeting, and didn't come back, asking for her president's approval. So this is a big contrast with what Mexico did in 97, 98, which was one of the key brokers of the OPEC Plus deal at the time. And it poses some interesting questions, because López Obrador could have had political cover. I mean, he is in a tough situation because a lot of the projects that Pemex is investing on are not profitable at this price range, and production is going to decline. So he could have said, in order to cooperate with this agreement, I will participate, maybe try to negotiate less than the magnitude of the 23%. Which is of course hard because everyone else is doing it. But what is shocking to me is that not only he did not, and now he said it this morning that President Trump offered him to cover for the part that he's not going to be cutting. But basically what he's offering is business as usual. It's not doing anything, because Mexico will be reducing production as much as he's offering, which is 100,000 barrels. So this is a very interesting development. I think it's unlikely to totally derail the deal, but it's it's going to create a lot of jitters about this happening, and probably a lot of pressures from many actors. And and by the way, the Saudis in the past have punished very heavily those countries that sort of didn't want to cooperate in this kind of deal. So let's see how they fare, but I think it's going to be, I think Mexico lost an opportunity to, do what it was already economically the sensible thing. But as you know, the president is very ideological. He wants to continue with his refinery. He wants to continue with his plan to increase production regardless of the profitability, and all of that will lead to massive losses for Pemex and a reduction in their credit ratings and a tough situation for Mexico in the future. Mark, go ahead to answer one of the questions that you have. Oh,
sure. Okay, so we had a couple of questions on Argentina. One would be, so what can Alberto Fernandez do once the COVID-19 honeymoon ends, and there's the need to really restart the economy and get the country moving back forward? That's going to be tricky, because while he does occupy now the pinnacle of power, he needs to consolidate it, as well as obtain the cooperation of other members of his neo-Peronist coalition. So we're thinking about the Kirchneristas, people who are aligned with Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, but also members of the labor unions, Hugo Moyano, and some of the more activist union leaders, and then social leaders like Juan Graboy, who continues even in the pandemic to cause problems. Getting all those individuals to cooperate and not work to increase social instability, but work to decrease it, will be crucial for Fernandez. If he's able to pull that off, then he could actually get the country moving forward, get the economy back up and started. But if the country starts to descend into social chaos and Peronists who are within his coalition but oppose him, or at least on the line with him, take advantage of the crisis situation to try to weaken Fernandez, then we could see Argentina spin once again out of control. And that's always a sort of latent threat that exists in Argentina. That is, if power sort of starts to collapse and disintegrate, the country doesn't have very strong institutions to sort of to keep at least a minimal level of stability going. And we can have a sort of a type of meltdown like we saw it in 2001. And then we know how long it took us to dig out of that hole, probably 3 to 4 years. And that was in an era when global commodity prices were going through the roof, which aided Nestor Kirchner's efforts there. One related question was related to natural gas consumption or projections in Argentina during the Austral winter, starting in June, July, and August. Much of that will depend on when the quarantine is lifted. I think right now they're looking at sometime in May, and then getting the businesses and industry back started. If we see industry get started back up, then natural gas consumption is likely to be closer to normal. And with the declines that we've seen in some parts of the Vaca Muerta, there could be greater imports from Bolivia, which is what one of the questions was related to. Argentina will do everything possible, though, to try to avoid having to go the LNG route. But on the other hand, if the economy doesn't get started and we remain in the economic doldrums, then we're likely to see a real collapse of natural gas demand, both because it won't be used for industry, but or supporting industry, but also cars will have fewer cars using compressed natural gas, and even home heating is likely to be lower because individuals will be trying to save every dime possible. So I think a lot depends on whether Fernandez can get the economy going back in June or not. And if he can't, then we're likely to see lower natural gas demand this winter.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Bolivia. There are a few questions. You just mentioned the issue about if Bolivia benefits from the fact that maybe Argentina is not going to be able to develop Vaca Muerta, and Bolivia might be able to export more to Argentina and similarly to Brazil. But I think that there might be some of that, but I think as a whole, Bolivia is in a very tough spot because, first of all, the price of natural gas is linked to the oil price. Second of all, Bolivia was one of the among the sort of the populist regimes of the left in Latin America, one of the best had one of the best macroeconomic management. But of course, that was relatively easy when things were going well. Bolivia had two very positive things happening for them. The prices going up. On top of that, the government of Evo Morales was able to take a bigger government take from that, and on top of that, they had a massive increase in reserves and production coming from the era of the previous era of Sanchez de Lozada, when the opening to significant new projects of exploration and production of natural gas was successful. But now Bolivia faces a very different scenario in which all things are pointing in the wrong direction. They don't have any fiscal space. They face a significant decline in natural gas production. It's hard for companies to be excited when they face the challenge of where to export the Bolivian gas, and every sort of alternative has some issues, both Argentina and Brazil having other significant resources, the traditional issues with Chile, exporting to Peru. So Bolivia, I think, faces a tough time, and that links to me with another question on Ecuador, which is, could this crisis in Ecuador lead to the election, to the coming back of Rafael Correa in Ecuador? One thing that I think, there was this speculation that in Latin America we had sort of a shift to the right, as we had the pink tide or the left turn in the previous decade. But what we have witnessed in Latin America is mostly an anti-incumbent wave of elections, rather than an ideological shift. So I think President Mauricio Macri is the first president in the history of South America to lose re-election. And I mean, we have other shifts, but not of presidents that were running in re-election. And we have seen very little of those in the whole history of Latin America, in part because re-election was not allowed until recently in many countries. granted. But during the good times, everyone was reelected. I now think that we will see a lot of president not being able to get reelected, and I think there is a big chance that Lenin Romero is one of those presidents who's not going to be reelected. I think also that a lot of these center-right or rightist presidents in Latin America are going to face tough times, like the ones that you have seen for Piñera in Chile or President Duque in Colombia, because they come into power in a situation in which the most of the things that they can offer is bitter medicine, or at least not. I mean, compared to the previous period, they cannot do as much. And this, when countries were already demanding more, and when the populations were dissatisfied with the political system and perceived them as corrupt. I mean, so this is a very bad combination of disappointment with the political establishment, with these very tough economic times ahead. So we don't know, I mean, because the sort of the rally around the flag phenomenon that for example, Alberto Fernandez has seen in Argentina, if the management of the coronavirus crisis might help some of these incumbents, but I tend to think that these are going to be really tough time overall in the region, and that most politicians will suffer in their popularity and their approval. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so we had a question about China's influence in the region, and China, I think, has the potential to pick up quite a large number of assets in the region, especially as prices fall. Cash is king in this type of economy, and China has quite a bit of reserves and has a long-standing strategy of working to try to invest in natural resources throughout Latin America. I would say that today, in fact, the Chinese government is far more influential than the US government in terms of its ability to exercise pressure over Latin American governments due to any type of threats of reducing investment or reducing importations from Latin American countries often carry greater weight than any potential sanctions or informal sanctions that the US government might bandy about. I'm not Central America, but I'm talking mostly about South America. So I would expect to see, to the extent to which China isn't preoccupied with internal problems, a continued growth, or at least maintenance of Chinese influence in the region. And then there was, let's see, another question on issues of migration. I think that's an issue, especially if we see a significant crisis in Mexico, in addition to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, or Nicaragua, the Central American countries. We may see a rise in the number of migrants attempting to come to the United States with two caveats. One is, as long as the US economy is in the doldrums, there's going to be less pull from the United States. And then also border enforcement has become more robust over the past 2 years, year and a half. And US public opinion, especially during the time of the crisis, is going to be more sympathetic to relatively extreme immigration measures, based at least in terms of rhetorical arguments on the idea of safeguarding the country against the transmission of the coronavirus across borders, even if that's not the real reason behind the actions. For instance, the US government right now is actively deporting people without really any due process who it catches near the US-Mexico border.
Yes, sure. I wanted to talk a little bit about Colombia. There are a couple of questions about Colombia. One about Colombia's strategy to develop the oil sector. You know, Colombia has been one of the most impressively successful countries with the resources that they have. I mean, the country has very little oil reserves, and nevertheless, it has been able to become one of the major producers in the region, and that has helped a lot the Colombian economy over the past decade and a half. But now it has some significant challenges, despite the fact that the National Hydrocarbon Agency has been doing a lot to try to attract investment to Colombia. But there is a combination of things that are problematic. First, as in other countries, but worse in Colombia, the production costs in Colombia are significantly higher than in other countries, particularly due to transportation costs to small fields. And as a result, that will produce some decline in investment in the Colombian oil industry. We saw something similar during the decline in the price of oil between 2014 and 2016. I think this time might be even worse. So that will make it hard for the efforts of the ANH, of the National Hydrocarbons Agency, to attract new investment. And the other thing is that the biggest potential for Colombia is in shale, and there has been a significant political opposition and social opposition to the development of shale, and they were politically going very cautiously to try to do some pilot projects to guarantee that the development of the shale will comply with environmental and other characteristics. But the fact is that all of this is likely to be delayed, and Colombia will confront relatively quickly a situation in which they don't have enough reserves to develop, and they will face a difficult time getting the type of fiscal revenues from oil that they were getting in the past. So Colombia, I think, is in a difficult spot. Having said that, Colombia, along with Peru and with Chile, were the countries that had managed the macroeconomy better in South America. So they, in a way, are in not such a bad position to begin with, compared to, of course, Venezuela or Argentina or Ecuador. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, well, I have a question about LNG projects, and I'll focus in on LNG projects in Argentina. For the Vaca Muerta to realize its true promise requires the development of LNG plants on the coast. Otherwise, you're really restricted in terms of export by pipeline to Chile and perhaps a little bit to Brazil, and then selling to the Argentine market. But by and large, every company knows that the Argentine market at best is a break-even proposition, and at worst is more likely to be a loss leader, and that the Argentine government over a medium term is never going to let you realize much in the way of a profit from selling natural gas to Argentine citizens. For political reasons, that's always going to be kept at the lowest possible. So companies are likely to oscillate between a very small profit and relatively middling to high losses. So to really develop the Vaca Muerta, you either need petrochemical plants to take advantage of the natural gas, or LNG facilities. But I think you're going to have companies very reluctant to get involved in any LNG project in Argentina right now, because of the fear that once you have that fixed asset, the Argentine government's ability to squeeze you becomes much higher. Right now, all of these companies have the advantage of shale in the sense that if they aren't getting a good price based on the dynamics and mechanics of shale, they can effectively stop production or stop drilling, and over time their liability becomes lower and lower because of shale being very productive at the start but not so productive after about 6 months to a year. So I would say for Argentina to truly take advantage of the Vaca Muerta, they need these LNG projects. But right now is probably not the time that many people will be investing, or anyone maybe outside of YPF will be investing in LNG projects in Argentina. Francisco?
Great. I will answer a couple of questions on Venezuela. There are many, but a couple of them. One is the issue with gasoline. Venezuela is facing a shortage of gasoline that is a combination of a lot of things that had happened in the past that became critical right now. The first one is the destruction of the refining capacity of Venezuela that has been systematically declining from 1.3 million barrels per day to most recently less than 100,000 barrels, but in particularly the capacity to produce high octane gasoline it doesn't exist in the country at this point. And they were getting by importing through swaps in which they exported Mercedes or other heavy grades of crude and swapped them for gasoline. That was done with the Russians, Rosneft, with Reliance of India, with Eni and Repsol in Europe. But those things came to a standstill when the U.S. Applied secondary sanctions to the Rosneft subsidiaries, and other companies got scared. And for that reason, Venezuela in the last 4 or 5 weeks has received just one cargo of gasoline, and is facing a very, very, very tough situation, in which the quarantine, by the way, helped them in the sense that it dramatically reduced, of course, gasoline consumption, but still not even the really small quantity of gasoline that is being consumed today in Venezuela, they can supply. Of course, gasoline is free, so that doesn't help at all, and there is still some smuggling. And by the way, Venezuela keeps sending oil, but also gas oil and other products to Cuba, which is astonishing considering the situation. I don't think the situation is likely to improve significantly, but I do think that because there is a lot of availability of gasoline in the market right now, if Venezuela gives some priority to it, they might be able to find, they have to pay. They probably will not even be able to do the swap, but if they pay, they can pay in dollars. They will be able to get some gasoline that maybe palliate the horrible crisis. But this combines with all that is happening in Venezuela to pose for a much worse economic decline that we had expected at the beginning of the year. This was supposed to be a year in which the Venezuelan economy will decline, but decline much less than the past few years. And I think at this point, it's actually going to be probably the worst year for the Venezuelan economy ever, which is a lot to say for a country that has its economy collapsed by two-thirds. Another question is about the recovery of the oil sector if there is a transition in Venezuela. So Venezuela has a spectacular resource base that should allow for some significant recovery, but that, because the Venezuelan state is broke and PDVSA is broke and without human resources and capabilities, will require massive investment from the private sector. We estimate that more than $120 billion to add about 2 million barrels per day of capacity, and that will take 7 to 10 years. Maybe at the very beginning there could be some early wins because of production capacity was just closed because of the current difficulty selling oil, or because you might be able to connect some wells that were drilled but not connected. But that's going to be some smaller wins at the beginning, and then you have the hard work of getting this, attracting this very massive investment. And imagine that with other countries, plenty of countries competing with Venezuela, with all the companies. We know that about 40% of the budget that was going to be allocated to investment by the oil companies, private oil companies in Latin America, has been announced that it's going to be cut. So, it's going to be a very tough time if the transition occurs now to attract those investments, and you will require a lot of conditions, some political stability, some the right institutional and contractual framework, and the willingness for these private companies to invest billions of dollars in Venezuela. I mean, the resource is there, but and by the way, sometimes some figures reported that Venezuela has very high costs. I think Venezuela can produce, if the price of oil it's about $35 can increase the production significantly, but it's going to be really, really tough for the country to develop these resources under conditions that are not favorable. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so I have a question about sort of a concern for developing the Vaca Muerta. What is is the bigger concern economic, or is it on expropriation? And I would say it's going to be more on, it's really more on expropriation or being vulnerable to extortion. That is the extent to, and that's sort of another way to think of expropriation. There's expropriation where they take the assets, and there's expropriation, which is even often a little more common in Argentina, where they violate, the government violates contracts, squeezes companies to maximize either revenue or corrupt payments to the government, and but the end result is the same for the company in that you're losing money. So I think the biggest concern with developing in Argentina is with shale right now, particularly shale oil. With shale right now, particularly shale oil, you have the ability to both export and then also stop with, if not on a dime, relatively quickly. And so there's less concern there. There's some pipeline and capacity concerns, but by and large, that's a reason, that's more of an economic factor. That is, it'll be more the price of Brent. For natural gas, the problem is that to really develop, as I mentioned earlier, the sector, you need stable rules and you need to have enough certainty that the government isn't going to essentially try to screw you at some point in the medium to near future, to the medium to long term by taking advantage of your sunk costs, say in an LNG plant or a petrochemical plant, to effectively violate contracts and get you to continue to produce at below market prices. So I think that's going to be a concern. On the oil side, I think it's more, on shale oil, I'd say it's more of a factor being dominated by economic concerns. And once Brent goes up, you're likely to see more investment, particularly in shale oil. On the gas side, though, that's the more complicated. And that's where I think until the Argentine government is able to convince investors that it's not going to change the rules of the game and squeeze them when the going gets tough, you're likely to see a reluctance, at least partial reluctance, to get in too deep. Another question will be on, I guess, on Sergio Massa. Sergio Massa right now, he was a presidential candidate, and he's now the Speaker of the Argentine lower house. He was perhaps one of the leaders that gave Alberto Fernandez that extra 10% that he needed to, instead of to defeat Mauricio Macri 48 to 42%, and say potentially losing to Mauricio Macri. He's very young, very dynamic. I think he does both a role to play in the future, and he also is seen as sort of a neutral actor between Cristina and Alberto Fernandez, so he can serve as a bridge between different sectors of Peronism. And I guess we have one final factor on YPF defaulting on their U.S. debt, that the government defaults. I think the YPF default will occur after a government default, but in the end, keep in mind with Alberto Fernandez is he's going to do what he believes he needs to do to stay in power. And if that's defaulting on his foreign debt, he's going to do it. And if they still need the money to default, for YPF to default, if they're that pressed for resources, he's likely to do it. That is, in a Peronist mindset, the thing you have to do is maintain power. There is no sort of idea of principles of rule of law or of maintaining contracts, and there's no medium to long-term thought of how a YPF default might negatively affect the country in the medium to long term. Everything will be focused on the short term. First, the 2021 midterms in October, and then the 2021 general elections in October of 2021. That's going to be his priority. And if he views that he has to do it, he's going to do it. There's not going to be any sort of, whereas Mauricio Macri might have really sort of fretted about it, thinking, I really don't want to do it. I don't want to damage the long-term health of YPF. From a Peronist mindset, you do what you have to do, and any rule can be rewritten if by following it or essentially continuing to pay, you run the risk of losing power.
Yes, two brief comments on two questions, and then we have to close with final comments from Mark, and maybe I can also give some. On two issues, Pemex. I mean, Pemex is in a very tough spot, with production declining, with capacities declining because the company lost some significant a significant portion of their best people in the last few years, and they face a very difficult situation with this price environment. Some of their fields can be developed at less than $35, but many of the plans that they have cannot. And on top of that, the president injecting billions of dollars, mostly for the development of a refinery that it's going to be losing money. I mean, everything points in a company that has $105 billion of debt, that has a significant additional debt in terms of pensions, that it's more manageable, but it's a problem. And on top of that, they face this situation in which they lost $18 billion and will lose more than that this year. I mean, all these with the reduction of their credit rating to junk is going to put tremendous pressure. I mean, I think Mexico was in a relatively good fiscal footing when López Obrador came into power, but everything is, I think, lost by next year, and all bets are off in terms of the Mexican macroeconomy and Pemex. Finally, about the effect of the OPEC quotas, as many of you know, I mean, only two countries were involved, which were Mexico and Ecuador. Mexico, of course, didn't want to participate. López Obrador keeps saying that he's only going to cut 100,000 barrels, which is nothing. Which, as I said, I think it's the wrong idea, because he would still need to actually reduce production because of the high cost of some of the production that he shouldn't be investing on. Having said that, Ecuador is the other country, but they had just an issue with their main pipeline, and therefore their production is going down even more than what they need to cut. So in the short term, that this doesn't even affect them, but eventually they will have to participate in the cut. So since we have only like 4 more minutes, maybe some closing comments, Mark, before.
Sure. Well, I'd like to one comment on Argentina, just to clarify that the goal of Argentina with its foreign debt, with its domestic debt, both foreign debt to IMF as well as private creditors, as well as to domestic creditors, and then YPF with its debt, their goal is to renegotiate. They definitely all want to renegotiate, and they're going to be very willing to renegotiate if they don't have to start making much in the way of principal or interest payments until after President Fernandez's reelection bid in October of 2023. They'll pretty much sign anything or close to anything if they're given those conditions. But if the creditors, either the IMF, private creditors, or YPF creditors, are not willing to give them until after the 2023 election, they're going to look on the default option much more favorably, because despite all of the negative consequences entailed with defaulting, either with IMF or with private creditors or with YPF defaulting with its creditors, they're going to be willing to take that chance if their only alternative is making payments that they believe, in interest payments and principal payments, that they believe they cannot afford to make, while simultaneously ensuring a successful midterm in 2021 and re-election for President Fernandez in 2023. And so if pushed to the wall and not given the type of agreement that they want to see, Argentina has no trouble defaulting. They've done it many times in the past, and they've recovered. And I think there's a belief in Argentina, it's often referred to as viveza criolla, the idea that Argentines are a little smarter than everybody else, and that they'll find a way to make it work, that they'll be able to default, but in the end, they'll get people to lend to them again. And the reality is that happened. They defaulted in 2001. And lo and behold, a whole host of people were loaning money to them in 2016, 2017, and 2018. And so the belief is they may have to stay out of capital markets for a while, but eventually people will forget and people will come in. And if the people got burned, that's their fault for being greedy. That's at least how a lot of Argentines and Pernists would look at this situation.
Great, thank you, Mark. So I think we're coming to an end. I just wanted to first say that you can follow both me and Mark on Twitter, and we continue, discussing these issues there. Of course, Mark is also one of the top experts on Texas politics and U.S. politics, so you will see more than Argentina and Latin America in his timeline. I just wanted to also mention that unfortunately I'm very pessimistic about what's going to happen in Latin America. I think this poses tremendous challenges, except for a few bright spots like Uruguay and Peru that might not get out of this in such a bad shape. Even the countries that have managed well recently their economy or for many years, like the case of Chile and Colombia, I think are going to be in a really tough spot politically, and because of the political unrest that they already were observing. And in the case of Brazil, that I think was doing a good job in the economic side, I think this is going to also get very problematic politically, particularly because of the leadership of President Bolsonaro. And I already mentioned the cases of Mexico and others. So we will continue this discussion. On next Wednesday, we have a very interesting webinar with Lourdes Melgar, the former Undersecretary of Energy of Mexico, that is our non-resident fellow, in conversation with Benigna Lais, our non-resident fellow, who also has a tremendous expertise on Mexico. So please join us for that and for the other events. The Center for Energy Studies will be doing a lot of webinars, and particularly, I think, on Fridays, these type of happy hours. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, and hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye.